When we first began to conceive of this symposium as an interdisciplinary exploration of the impact of craft, its future, its relationship to other disciplines, we immediately, at once, thought of our keynote speaker tonight. He is one of the world's most prolific and influential historians and theorists of craft and design, especially on the relationships between craft and other disciplines and the use of postmodern theory to rethink the politics and practices of craft. Currently, he is the Deputy Head of Research and Head of Graduate Studies at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where he leads the History of Design graduate program collaboratively offered by the V&A and the Royal College of Art. His many published works include Industrial Strength Design, How Brooks Stevens Shaped Your World, Gord Peteron, Furniture Meets Its Maker, perhaps most notably Thinking Through Craft in 2007. He's the editor of the Craft Reader in 2010, co-editor with several other people of the triannual Journal of Modern Craft, and a frequent contributor to Arts in America, Crafts, and American Craft, and this list could go on and on. He is presently working on an exhibition about postmodernism to be held at the Victoria and Albert in September of 2011. And with the mention of postmodernism, I'm drawn to mention again the book that introduced me to his work, Thinking Through Craft. The author's intention in this book is to see craft, quote, not as a subject for celebration or self-congratulation, nor as a disqualification for serious artistic enterprise, but rather as a problem to be thought through again and again, unquote. Craft is certainly many things, but it is always a field of inquiry, informing and challenging every other creative field, always changing, always shaping other creative practices. As our speaker has said, craft only exists in motion. Please join me in welcoming Glenn Adamson.
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Real pleasure. Thank you to Deborah and everyone else who's put so much effort into putting this event together. And I have to say it is both thrilling and awe-inspiring and slightly daunting to be in your company. Probably as impressive a gathering of 21st century craft thinkers and practitioners as has ever been assembled. So well done, everyone. I'm sure you're going to be enjoying the next 2 days tremendously, and I hope I can get us off to a good start in that respect. I wasn't necessarily planning to do this, but I thought I might just say something very quickly about the name of the host institution, since it has been raised. I wasn't going to be the first one to bring it up. But last time I was here, which was 2 years ago, when perhaps the wounds were fresher amongst those who consider themselves to have been injured, I was asked what I thought about the disappearance, erasure of the word craft from the title of the school. And I said that although it was understandable that many people would be upset, and I in some ways shared that sentiment, that it was also true that sometimes an absence could be more powerful than a presence, and that if what happened in changing the name led people to try to fill the hole over and over and over again with their words, then it probably would have turned out to have been a good thing. And I think that this event is certainly some indication that that promise has been fulfilled. I would say, before we hasten to congratulate ourselves, however, that this the good thing about a name that's on the letterhead is it kind of sticks around. The thing about activism is that you have to keep doing it. So I hope that this will be the first of many such events, all of which will conflict in interesting ways with the previous ones. So on to my first slide. This is not, in fact, a work by Alison Smith, nor is it a sort of test trial logo for the conference, although you might think so. It is, as those of you who have, like me, lived in the Midwest will surely know, the seal of the great state of Wisconsin. And what you're seeing is the state motto forward, with the state animal, who I'm afraid I can't identify from this image, and a farmer and a miner. Ezra Shales, a thatcher and a miner, sorry. Right. So two skilled practitioners. Right. Thank you. Good correction there. Huh? So great state of Wisconsin, having presented itself as hurtling forward through the shoals of modernity on the brawny backs of these two gentlemen. I think it's interesting to note that, as our first speakers said, Deborah and Allison, the way that one often goes forward when craft is involved is instinctively to go backwards first, which of course is what I'm doing here. And it is instructive to notice that Wisconsin has always, I suppose, thought that its way forward was through a kind of retrenchment of sorts in tradition and skills, and it's not alone in that respect. So it's a very appropriate slide with which to start, and it's appropriate in a second sense too, which you will have perhaps have already guessed if you've been reading the newspapers recently. Wisconsin is at the vanguard in a way that perhaps it's not so excited about. It's at the vanguard of labor conflict surrounding the incursion of the Tea Party movement into actual seats of political power. And of course, it's precisely skilled, semi-skilled, and as well unskilled labor that is at the absolute crux of tensions, conflicts, and political combat when ideological conflicts emerge into the scene. So Wisconsin is a good place to watch, I would suggest, if you're interested in histories and futures of skill. So how do we grapple with something as upsetting and indeed absurd as the recent goings-on in the state that I used to live in for 5 years? The answer obviously has to revert to these two phrases that were already mentioned by Steve Beale, craft thinking, and by Allison, the motto of the school, theory and practice. How do we theorize craft, this thing that does not seem to want to be theorized, that seems grounded in the hands, that seems grounded in, indeed, the tacit, the unspoken? How do we get explicit about this messy business with all of its depth, all of its silences, all of its subtleties, nuances, and material concerns? How do we drag this into the field of discourse without doing it a kind of disservice? That's the task that I suppose I set for myself in speaking to you tonight. And I thought it would be interesting to try to tackle it by looking at very, very material concerns indeed, at dynamics that one can see, even without a lot of knowledge, in craft practices, specific craft practices. And the three I'll be focusing on are wood carving, which is premised on the principle of friction, weaving, which is premised on the principle of tension, and pottery, ceramics, as well as other practices, which seem to me to suggest something about eccentricity. And I'll try to make that clear when I get to the end of the lecture, but for now you might think of eccentricity simply as being slightly out of round. Okay. Now, that idea of being slightly out brings me to a kind of inevitable figure in my mind for any attempt to theorize practice, to theorize craft, David Pye. This is a detail of a bowl carved by David Pye, British craft theorist. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with his thinking. He's perhaps best known for having developed a theory about risk and certainty, in which he opposed two kinds of making: the workmanship of risk, often associated with craft, and the workmanship of certainty, often associated with mass production in the machine. So, if you will, this is risk, Warren Mackenzie vase on the left, and on the right, a Wedgwood Art Deco vase from the 1920s, certainty. Very interesting comparison, and not chosen innocently, because as you can see, the Wedgwood vase simulates the hand-throwing marks of the handmade, the throwing marks of the handmade thing without actually having been produced in that way. So it's a very certain object which seems to have lust in its heart for the uncertainty that craft can impart. And indeed, Pye was, although relatively non-judgmental about the relationship between workmanship of risk, workmanship of certainty. In other words, he thought that they were good for different things, and that the undertaking of the designer or the manufacturer or the maker was simply to identify the best way for achieving the result, the best point, as it were, on the invisible number line between absolute risk and absolute certainty. Although he was relatively non-judgmental, he did make some room in his writings for what he called diversity, which means something different from what we usually mean when we say diversity now. He meant simply the kind of human touch, the subtle variations of an object like the one on the left, as opposed to the sameness and homogeneity of an object like the one on the right. However, he would have been the first to point out that even within the workmanship of certainty, there's a lot of handwork involved. And the image on the left here is a very good one for demonstrating that. It's the simple use of a compass, a hand tool that is entirely about creating certainty. On the right, a cross-section of a jigger assembly, and this allows you to produce a pot just like the one that I just showed you on the right. And if you don't think that that's a skilled activity, I invite you to visit your local pottery and try it. So the workmanship of certainty is not necessarily opposed to skill. It simply exists in a different relationship to skill, one that has to do with knowledge of a different kind of tooling, and one that has to do perhaps less with expression, individuality, and the artistic impulse. And this indeed is why, if we think in art historical terms, we tend to think almost exclusively, until the 20th century anyway, in terms of the workmanship of risk, things that are done with the hand in such a way that they seem to embody the individuality and indeed spirit of the maker, as in Asian calligraphy, which of course becomes influential on abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock. So here we have complete workmanship of risk, in the sense that there's no tooling that regularizes the marks that Pollock is making on the painting. Another very interesting thing about Pollock, which is worth noting, is that he's using the tool wrong. So he will pour paint from a can, which you're not supposed to do necessarily, onto a painting. You're supposed to use a brush, or if he's going to use a brush, he will not actually touch the canvas with it. He may even turn it around and dip the wooden end of it in the paint and then drip a thinner line onto the canvas. So in all these ways, he allows himself to be experimental and adaptive and free in his use of tools. So even when he has the opportunity to achieve certainty through his tools, he rejects it. And this, again, is a well-known motif within the history of art, and I'm certainly not telling you anything you don't know when I say it, but I just want to put down as a marker other examples like Yves Klein's use of a flamethrower on gold paint to create some of his works, or his outrageously sexist and now offensive use of living bodies as paintbrushes. So in some way, a kind of extension of the thinking of Pollock in using a brush the wrong way. Namjoon Paik using his own head or his own hair in this piece, Zen for Head. Andy Warhol encouraging his friends at the factory to piss on oxidized paintings and essentially use their bodies as paintbrushes in a different way. So what we see in the history of post-war art in the main is an absolute association between expression, which can also include conceptualism, as is implied by the Paik work, and risk in the sense of openness, freedom, uncertainty, accident, randomness, a kind of flirtatious, dynamic, and interesting flirtation with the actual physical result. That's very different from the kind of management of risk that we see in a design process, much less totalizing, much less individualized, and much more about tooling. So an example that Pai uses is the simple task of taking a piece of paper and cutting it in half, or smaller pieces. So he says, well, if you want to do this and you're not particularly concerned about the result in terms of exactness, in other words, you don't mind the workmanship of risk, you might simply tear it in half with your hands. If you're interested in more exactness than that, then you will start to resort to tools. The first one you'll use is your own hand, and you'll crease the paper, fold it, right? If you want more certainty than that, you might use your thumbnail as a tool and burnish that edge before you tear. You might then resort to scissors, which are, of course, self-jigging. The blade that does the cutting is also the thing that guides the cut. Then you might use what Pai called a guillotine, which is to say a paper cutter, to achieve the same result, increasing certainty all the way along as the tooling gets more and more sophisticated. And I suppose, although he doesn't say this, if you wanted to get much more certain than that, then you need to go out and buy yourself a paper mill. And here we, of course, encounter the relationship between the workmanship of certainty and the reality of industry. So that the certainty that Pai is talking about, which is quite technical in some sense and entirely physical, having to do with a result, having to do with the relationship between hands, tools, and material, now is instead transported or displaced into a matter of economy, a matter of social footprint as well, the people that invest in this factory, the people that build the tools in this factory, and of course the operatives that work in the factory. What's interesting about this image to me is that although when I just showed it to you, you took it as an image of industry and I suppose forwardness, progress, improvement, scale, it actually is an image that to some people would read as nostalgic, because it's a small paper mill in England that has been replaced by larger paper mills in Asia. And the paper industry in England, like so many other industries involving skill and industry, has in fact collapsed in the face of competition from abroad. And this, I think, brings us to a point that actually Pi is quite weak on, which is that every one of the design processes and craft processes, making processes that he talks about, has indeed a social footprint. So that when we think about tooling, we can't think about it as if it floats in some kind of ether, as if it's in a vacuum. We have to think about it in terms of access to tools, as the slogan of the great countercultural Bible, the Whole Earth Catalog, had it, the sort of Sears catalog of the left from the late 1960s. And I think it's access to tools that allows us to begin to theorize craft in political terms. So if we start to think about what tools do physically, and then we begin to think about that process as having necessary implications in not only aesthetic terms, in other words, the design result, which is what Pi was interested in, but also in social terms, and therefore necessarily in political terms, then we begin to have a way of doing what Wolflin, the great art historian, called the great problem of art historical theory in general, which was, as he said, to build a path from the mason's yard to the scholar's studio. How do you get from the sheer act of making to the process of thinking? How do you get from practice to theory, as this school seems to want to do? Well, that's a problem that's becoming more and more pressing all the time, partly because of gleeful proclamations like this one, which I encountered on the side of a London taxi just before coming over here. Sounds great, doesn't it? Outsource anything. And this, of course, I'm not telling you anything again that you don't know, is the condition that we live in. We now expect work to be displaced. We now expect hands to be doing the work of others, and we consider any form of autonomous workmanship in which the labor is being done by the person who brought the labor into being as an exception, as a rarity, something to be preserved, something perhaps to be militantly preserved. So this is, if you like, the background against which I offer the rest of this talk. I want to offer one other idea from, if you like, the grand narrative of craft theory before turning to my examples of friction and tension and eccentricity, and that's from Ruskin. And this is a passage that I've been thinking about a lot recently from an essay called Unto This Last, which he published, as you can see, in 1862. I won't read the quote because I really hate it when people read quotes off PowerPoint slides. It makes me feel like I'm at a business conference. But I'll just sort of translate and say that he's here making the point that the relationships between, let's say, a boss and a worker in a factory should be more like the relationships that occur in a family than they were in those days, and indeed than they still are now. So you should treat your workers well because you should regard them like your children, or you should work well because you regard your employers as like your parents, let's say. And of course, we can also think about other sorts of familial structures that might map onto economic and productive structures. What Ruskin doesn't say is that families come in all shapes and sizes, and lots of them are dysfunctional. And I think that's a key point. I know that sounds funny, but I think it's a key point, because if we are to agree with him that work has to be guaranteed not by health and safety regulations or contractual law, but instead by what he calls affection, if we are to adopt an affective relation to one another, then we should expect that relation to include a lot of ugliness and conflict and disagreement and indeed exploitation. So I don't think in any way that Ruskin's idea of a familial structure of work necessarily gets us out of the problem of outsourcing, let's say, but it may give us the tools to understand it a bit better. And my argument, as you'll see at the end of the talk, is going to be that craft is the way of doing that, or at least a great way of doing that, a way of grappling with the reality of our relations to one another that are brought into being by production. So that's sort of where I'm going. And I'm going to get there through these three ideas. First, friction, which I think, if you're an art historian, is maybe most easily associated with the concept of an avant-garde. So here one thinks of the futurists, but also any artistic movement that positions itself at the cutting edge of culture, at the cutting edge of art practice. And as this painting aptly demonstrates, the futurist instinct or the avant-garde instinct is a matter of cutting in to a status quo, cutting into a body in some way, and it has an inherent violence to it. It is oppositional. It embraces conflict as its value. This is the idea of shocking the bourgeoisie, yeah? So this is a very familiar idea. The avant-garde is cutting edge. But we very rarely associate the concept of the avant-garde with a scene like this one, the studio of Robin Wood, a friend of mine who also runs the Craft Heritage Craft Heritage Foundation in Britain, and this is some of his work on the right. He's a pole lathe turner. Those of you who have never seen a pole lathe in action should see if you can get the opportunity. The pole provides the spring that drives the workpiece through a rope that's attached to both the pole and a pedal beneath the worker's foot. So he's revived this ancient craft. He's a great example of what Steve Beale called the craft resurgence, Mark Breitenberg spoke about so well earlier, that we're undergoing at the moment. And he, of course, is also a practitioner of cutting-edge activities. It's just that his cutting edge is held in his hands. It's not metaphorical. And he's gone around to different communities in Britain, including Sheffield, where he's gone to find the people that maybe made one of those pairs of scissors that Pi was contemplating in the 1960s, but a kind of worker, professional blade sharpener that hardly exists anymore, certainly not in Britain. And he's tried to document these people's practices. He's tried to, I suppose, accord them the kind of respect that they deserve as skilled practitioners. So he is precisely someone who believes that the way forward is to go back, to understand where we've been and try to hold on to it tightly. But I'm perhaps going to sideline that issue for a moment and think in more technical terms, perhaps as Pi might, about what it means to be using a cutting edge when you work. Let's burrow into that idea for a second. Well, here are some cutting tools that are meant to be mounted in a machine lathe, machine cutter, like this one. And I think what's interesting about a cutting tool like this is that its action is concentrated at a single edge or a single point. So everything about this big piece of apparatus is engineered around a single point or line of friction. And the friction is where the work happens. The friction is where the judgment happens as well. So the craftsperson using this tool will perhaps retract the blade from the workpiece, the wood or the metal, whatever's being cut, and evaluate it. Is it the right cut? Is it the right fineness? Does it have the right finish? And it's only at that one margin or horizon that the judgment needs to be applied, despite the fact that you have this enormous, heavy, complicated machine. And you could say that the logic of the tool flows towards that horizon and then out of that horizon, in the sense that if you feel that the cut you're getting from the tool is inadequate in some way or inaccurate in some way, let's say it's accurate to the 1,000th of an inch, but you want a cut that's accurate to the 10,000th of an inch, you may need to do things that are far away from that cutting edge. You may simply, for example, need to make the machine heavier so that it doesn't vibrate as much, for example. But the judgment will always be made by making another cut and seeing if you have, in fact, improved the tool to the extent that you wanted to. So this is a very interesting metaphor for me because it seems to replicate spatially and technically, in terms of tool design, exactly the mentality that one seems to observe in the avant-garde, in the sense that the avant-garde makes a single work, like that painting that I showed you earlier, a single point, at which friction is applied. And in some ways, we tend to caricature this, and we think, perhaps especially of the futurists, as having sent their paintings out as inflammatory devices that would somehow bring a new future into being through the sheer conflagration that they would engender, through their shockingness, through the frictional qualities that they were able to apply on the existing art world. And of course, there's been much thinking about that model since, much thinking about what an avant-garde is and how they perform. But the basic idea of an avant-garde exactly operates in that same tooling conception that I've just outlined in the case of a lathe. So that's a very interesting idea to me. The fact that you would have this brutally physical concern that seems to be the province of craftspeople and engineers on the one hand, and a very metaphorical, political, aesthetic set of concerns that seems to be the province of artists and perhaps philosophers. So how do we understand that perhaps in a bit more depth, and how do we start to make that observation about the symmetry between a practice and a theory? How do we put that into some sort of force? Well, I'm going to try to do that for you, first by giving you the history of carving in 3 slides. First, this object, which is in, I'm very happy to say, the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And this is perhaps the most famous example that we have of the work of Gridling Gibbons, the early 18th century Baroque carver. It's actually only attributed to Gridling Gibbons, but it certainly demonstrates the skill and finesse for which he is known. And yes, it is a wood carving. It's not a lace cravat. It just looks like one. So it's a trompe-l'oeil sort of extraordinary specimen piece of Gibbon's skill, or at any rate its maker's skill. So realistic, in fact, that one of its owners, the famous waspish wit of the 18th century, Horace Walpole, once wore it at his collar when welcoming guests to a dinner party to see if they would notice. And although I haven't had a chance to handle this, you can certainly imagine what it would be like to touch. It's as thin as the lace that it imitates. So this is carving, right? This is high skill. This is complete mastery of the logic of the cutting edge, and presumably also of tools, because you can imagine that whoever made this thing really knew how to sharpen his chisels and everything else that he needed to do in order to bring this extraordinary thing into being. Well, great. Problem is that people who are trying to make money don't tend to like this kind of thing, especially if they're starting up a factory, because fundamentally they don't want to be dependent upon the whims of somebody who might think that this was a great way of spending their time. And I'm being a little bit facetious here again, but certainly if you wanted to tell the story of wood carving in 3 slides, you could do a lot worse than to go from this image to this image, which is from the middle of the 19th century. It's a kind of satirical print, but it tells a very true story about what happened to the furniture industry as a result of modernization. Not modernization, by the way, because of machines, because almost nothing in the furniture industry except for the sort of raw preparation of timber was done by machine until very late 19th, early 20th century, and this image predates that. So not because of machines, but rather because of reorganization of work. So what happened was that all of these skilled people, including the carvers, found themselves, usually in East London, in the case of Britain, working in garrets and doing job work. So being paid by the piece, not much by the piece, having to work as quickly as they possibly could, constantly being knocked down by the middlemen, this kind of Dickensian figure in his top hat, always a reliable signifier of evil in 19th century satirical prints, who is going to mediate between the poor furniture maker, who you see the sad sack there on the left, and the fat cat client on the right, who has a gut, another sure signifier of evil in 19th century satirical prints. So what you have here is not actually a fundamental transformation in the craft in material terms. What you have instead is a kind of, as I say, a kind of mediation, an interference in the relationship between the maker and the client. And that, of course, is where the power play happens. So you might say that the friction that's being applied by the carver is superseded by another more purely economic kind of friction that's then applied against the carver, which supersedes or dominates what he's trying to do with his hands. And therefore, no Gridling Gibbons. And we have a narrative about the impoverishment and loss of craft, which is still with us today, a kind of crisis, a sense of disappearance, a sense of erasure that perhaps explains why people get so upset when otherwise lovable art schools change their name. Any time that we see craft being pushed around like that, we tend to want to rush to its defense, because who do you identify with in this picture, right? Third slide, Alexander McQueen. 3 shoes that I photoshopped together here, or PowerPointed together. I don't know how to use Photoshop. These shoes are his, I should have said the late Alexander McQueen, great sainted British fashion designer, and I don't want to take anything away from him because he was very good at what he did, but this is a very good example of the mediation applied to craft that I just showed you in the middle of the 19th century being updated for 21st century concerns. So this is a series of shoes with heels and soles based on the carving of Grinling Gibbons. But as you can immediately spot, there's no hand-carved wood anywhere in sight. In fact, these 3 heels and soles are exactly identical because they're cast and reproduced on other materials. So what you have then is a presentation of the image of craft, the impression of craft, quite literally, in fact, in the hopes that the finesse, the skill, the control, the sophistication of tooling, the management of the workmanship of risk that Pi talked about will still be felt in the finished object, even though it's been made entirely through the workmanship of certainty. And this, of course, is one of the ways that the fashion industry operates, and any industry that operates like the fashion industry operates, in a category into which I would include contemporary design, which more and more obeys the logic of seasonal collections and other features of haute couture behavior. And what tends to happen in all of those kinds of contexts is that craft is either mediated in the sense of being put off stage, controlled, subjugated in the way that that furniture jobber was, or it's obviated entirely through the use of a superseding technology, which presents craft at one remove and therefore does away with the difficult frictional influence applied by the carver or the craftsman or craftswoman of any other kind. That's the history of carving in 3 slides, but now I want to give you one last example, which maybe gets us to a little bit more of a politicized understanding of how this shakes out in real life in the art world. And although I should say that, just parenthetically, that although I have felt often since publishing Thinking Through Craft that it would be much better if I could stop talking about art and start looking at other things that really matter, I find that it's almost impossible for me, perhaps because of something to do with my training as an art historian or my disposition or the symbolic power of artworks. But I, again and again, go back to the idea that art, although it has historically had an oppositional relationship to craft, which, as I've argued, it treats as supplemental and secondary, art nonetheless is one of the great technologies that we have for understanding the way that craft operates. And so I'm going to continue to talk about it with your permission. So this is Wim Delvoye. This is, as you can see, a concrete mixer carved in wood, which I can assure you that Delvoye had nothing to do with making by hand. He commissioned it from carvers in his native Flanders, and it was one of a series of these works that obviously referenced the post-industrial condition that he was making in the 1990s. Here's another example. This is an entire full-scale cement truck carved in wood, not in Flanders, but in Indonesia, out of teak. So what is Delvoye trying to do here? Certainly, he seems to be thematizing not only the post-industrial condition, but also the reality of outsourcing, which I referred to earlier, that makes the global post-industrial economy go round. So he's giving you so much highly skilled outsourced labor that you cannot miss it. It is indeed the content of the work, the astonishing level of other people's skill that he's presenting anonymously through his own authorship. And so in some ways, he seems to be involving himself in a kind of critique of the fact of outsourcing. And again, this is about 15 years old, this work. I should remind you of that. So perhaps he doesn't have access to the kinds of complex discourses around globalization that we do now. However, I still wanted to use the example because this isn't the end of the story. There's a kind of twist in the tale. once he brought this truck back to Europe, you're seeing it here in a gallery, European gallery, as it were, once his back was turned, he heard that the carvers with whom he'd been working were making knockoffs of this that were miniature. I imagine them to be about this size, although surprisingly his studio has not returned my emails on this point, and I don't know for sure, and I don't have an image of one to show you, but you can imagine it. And they were selling, the carvers were selling these as tourist souvenirs locally in Indonesia. And although, yeah, exactly. Theaster Gates has immediately grasped the purpose of this tale. So I would submit to you that although Wim Delvoye had a right to be horrified by this, and he was, I got this from an interview where he said basically, can you imagine them doing this? I would submit to you that that miniaturized version of this Delvoye sculpture is a much more provocative object, partially for not being an authorized artwork. That is one of the things that makes it so provocative, because its authorship is even more uncomfortable than this, and yet more honest, because these objects actually were being made by people for their livelihood. So this is a story about other people's hands resting themselves, holding themselves to, as it were, the bodies of their owners, and then being redeployed so that they don't become other people's hands, they simply become the hands of the maker again. And it's a very powerful fable, I guess, in some way. It's a 21st century or late 20th century fable about carving. And just to wrap up this story about friction, you can see that the avant-garde instincts of Delvoye to make an uncomfortable, shocking work that gets you to think about outsourcing very much in the way that, for example, Ai Weiwei's sunflower seed installation at the Tate Turbine Hall recently, it gets you to understand something about outsourcing. For those of you who don't know, he had 100 million sunflower seeds made out of porcelain and then dumped them on the floor in the Tate. So in the way that those artworks are avant-garde, they apply a kind of friction to you by upsetting you about the fact of their own making. But equally, it's clear that those of us who aren't art stars can decide what to do with those kind of gestures, and in some cases, perhaps, even if it's only in marginal, unauthorized spaces, in some way reclaim the labor that's been put to that use, and so apply a kind of friction that is very different from, and in some ways oppositional to, the frictional mechanisms of the avant-garde. Okay, that's part one. Part two is tension, and this is a story about weaving. As many of you will know, textiles are the field in which the exploitation of labor has been most discussed. It was really the British textile industry that fueled the Industrial Revolution, and partly for that reason and partly because of the absolutely desperate condition of the people working in the plants there, was singled out by Engels and Marx for particular attention when they formulated the theories of socialism and communism. And here I'm showing you a Lewis Hine photograph from just after 1900, not an image from Britain at the early to mid-19th century, but of course child labor is a big part of this, and it's a story that we still have with us today. So this is another kind of muckraking photograph that I simply got online. It's a sort of anti-globalization, anti-exploitation image, and its rhetoric is remarkably similar, I think, to that 100-year-old image of Lewis Hine's, the sort of plaintive child being presented to you in this kind of cry for help. Again, not too different from that jobber furniture maker in the East End either. So we know that textiles is not just any craft. It is the field of enterprise in which the thinking about labor exploitation was developed. It was the spur to the theory that allows us to understand the political reality of practice. And it occupies, in my mind, a very preeminent role, therefore, not only in craft history, but also in design history, industrial history, and social history. But again, I want to focus on just one aspect of weaving, which is this principle of tension. And here I may go badly awry because I'm certainly no expert, but I think it's safe to say that cloth, when woven on a loom, is always requires tension. And what's held in tension, of course, is the warp, so the thread that's actually fixed to the loom. What makes the weaving happen, though, is the passing of a weft thread sideways through the warps. And that weft thread, of course, is not held in tension. It is free in some ways. Again, in most kind of plain weaving or hand loom weaving. I realize there are exceptions to that when we get into mechanization. But it suggests to me that weaving in this simple way, creation of basic patterns, is organized technically around an opposition between an element that's held in tension, the warp, and an element that moves fluidly according to the choice and expressive instincts of the weaver. So warp and weft. Now, just again, to revert to the history of post-war art, I think it's interesting that when artists use textiles, and I'm conscious of Elisa Auther, our greatest living textile historian being in the audience, they tend to look at the weft only. So they do things like this, Marcel Duchamp's installation of String in the New York Gallery, which I almost want to call an artwork that's all weft, right? It has no tension in it for exactly the reasons that I was talking about before when I was talking about Andy Warhol and Namjoon Pike and Jackson Pollock and Yves Klein. What's wanted here is a conceptual gesture, is a gesture that has to do with perhaps a kind of expression, perhaps an expression that's based on anti-expressiveness, but an expression nonetheless, and certainly the extreme individuality of Duchamp as a practitioner. And so what he doesn't want is for you to admire his handiwork, right? And so if he's going to use string, he's going to use this kind of element, he's going to do it not only without a loom, but he's going to go as far away from loom work as he possibly can. And that means not using the kind of tension that would be imparted by a proper tool. Obviously, there is tautness in this design, but there's not that characteristic interlinking because what he wants is something free. And a more extreme version of that, I guess, would be this piece by Robert Morris. And here I'm conscious that Julia Bryan Wilson is in the audience, one of our greatest living commentator on Robert Morris and other post-minimalist sculptors. But all the same, I will offer you the example of thread waste. I told you at the beginning it's a tough room. The thread waste, this piece that he made entirely using the sort of waste offcuts of a textile factory. And it's perhaps a little bit of an aside, but I'll just point out that artists often tend to identify very strongly with waste materials coming out of a factory. Why? Because factories are optimized, they're efficient, they're rational, they're predictive, and they're completely beholden to economic imperative. So what is an artist going to like? The thing that the factory hates most, the stuff that's left after it's done its work. And they also may like accidental things, like the inadvertent marks of a tooling on a work piece that then have to be cleaned off. Pretty much anything that's going to annoy a capitalist or a manufacturer, an artist is going to love. And waste material is kind of exhibit A of that. So again, all weft. So what would it look like if an artist were to deal with the idea of tension and install that at the heart of the work? Well, those of you who have followed contemporary fiber art over the last couple of years will not be surprised that this is my choice as an example. This is Ann Wilson's piece, Local Industry. And Ann Wilson's not here tonight, but her colleague Joan Livingston is, and told me that the book about this project has just been printed, so you should get your hands on a copy. It's an installation that was done at the Knoxville Museum of Art in Knoxville, Tennessee. So just briefly, what Anne did was to assemble lots of spools of thread, sort of found materials, in this city, Knoxville, which used to be a center of the garment industry and the textile weaving industry. So very much like Stoke-on-Trent, which used to be the ceramics industry hub for Britain, it's fallen on hard times, and so one can only approach this material in this place with a heavy heart, with a sense of disappearance, exactly the kind of anxiety around erasure and loss that I mentioned earlier, okay? So she's dealing with very charged material, much more charged than it would be in most American cities. So then she invited in the local community, here they are, to you laugh, but it's exactly this kind of audience that artists probably should be reaching. So these people who were not trained or skilled in any way with textiles were asked to wind bobbins and Wilson and her team of assistants taught them to do this. And then the bobbins were passed along to more skilled practitioners who indeed mostly had learned their skills in exactly that textile industry that had collapsed. And maybe another aside, I'll just point out that here Wilson is not idealizing, but certainly celebrating the skills of exactly the workers that Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and then following them, William Morris, pitied, right? So it's precisely the textile workers with the kind of assembly line jobs, skilled but alienated, that we wish we still had if we live in Knoxville, because it's the disappearance of those jobs that have impoverished the city or certainly threatened the city's economy and have broken lives. So the thing that Morris thought was the greatest problem is in a way what Wilson is holding up as something of a kind of, well, certainly an object of nostalgia, right, and something to celebrate. So a kind of strange irony that perhaps speaks to the difference between living in a post-industrial context now as opposed to an industrial context, which is, of course, what Marx and Morris were living through. Okay, so what do these weavers do? They make a cloth on this loom, an endless cloth, or at least as endless as it could be made to be. Here it is forming. Each weaver's work, because they sit there for so many hours, and then they separate what they've done with a black line, and then the next weaver comes in, and you can see the different choices of color from the different weavers using these locally wound bobbins very clearly in this image. And then this is just one section of the finished result. A fascinating object, partly because I think it looks so much like a barcode, and in some ways it's like an anti-barcode, right? Because this is not in any way dematerialized, and it can't be scanned to give you hard information. It can only be contemplated as a kind of archive of the hands and lives, these little fragments of the lives of the people that made it. And since she is working with these skilled weavers, one knows that those lives are in some ways inherited from or directly derived from this lost industry. So it could also be considered to be a kind of local flag, maybe, in some ways, like a flag for Knoxville, perhaps. And of course, it also refers to domestic textiles like a table runner, or perhaps a kind of floor rug, floor covering of some kind. So what we have here is an artist who's thinking about the principle of tension, remember tension, the warp, as something that she's set up and is in some ways identifying with as the controlling artist, the situation that she's constructed. The weft is something that she's leaving her weavers, the participants, the volunteers, to determine for themselves. And so she's not interested in what Duchamp and Morris were interested in. She's not interested in all weft. What she's interested in is constructing what Ruskin would have called an affective relationship between the thing that imposes tension, in other words, the thing that creates the art experience, the unusual thing, the thing that's rigid, the thing that says, the person that says, Ann Wilson, that says, you will sit at this loom that I've provided you, and you will weave, and you will obey these rules so that I can get this object. And she's placed her decision-making, that kind of tension that she's imposing on these people, explicitly in relationship to their skills and explicitly in relationship to their choices, which again are mapped one-to-one in this object. So this is a kind of extrapolation of the tenseness of weaving, the physical principle, the material principle of textile, into a metaphorical but also quite a literal political engagement between an art star and this group of people in a way that creates a kind of temporary or snap community. So very much unlike Delvoye's work, which operates according to a kind of tension or active exploitation that raises ethical issues that are perhaps upsetting, what Wilson is trying to do is circumvent those conditions by engaging her workers, her skilled workers, in a different way. And I think it's crucial here that the workers are indeed skilled and unskilled. So she's permissive in that regard. And I think it's also interesting to think about the shapes of these two examples, with friction, as I said, being at a single point or line, and weaving requiring two elements, some kind of duality or dialectic that's staged actively within the work. And that's not to say that wood carving is regressive and exploitative and textiles is kind of utopian and progressive. So if craft forward has to be textiles, that's not the point. The point is that here we see a craft principle that's displaced into a kind of metaphorical terrain in such a way that the possibilities are made into a kind of positive political instrument. Okay. The last part of the talk is about eccentricity. And I did promise you pottery, but there's also going to be stuffed animals, which I just offer you as an inducement to stay awake through this last bit. So just to remind you, eccentricity, throwing a pot, you can try really hard, you can be really good at it, still difficult to make it round, right? It's going to be a little bit out of round, and in fact, that's what we like if we're, like pie, interested in the diversity of our physical environment. Super simple idea. Workmanship of risk, what you get is eccentricity. Now, there have been lots of aesthetic, lots of moments of aestheticization in which regularity and certainty were what were prized, not eccentricity. And I'll show you a kind of obvious example, which is the ball bearing. Not just any ball bearing. The detail of the one on the right is indeed this ball, taken from this ball bearing, which is, you can just see it on the plinth on the right-hand side, the sort of donut shape on the vertical plinth. And that's, of course, at the machine art show that was at the Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s, a moment when propellers and insulation materials and chemical flasks and other things were held up as kind of stylistic icons for design. And here, at this moment, of course, what was prized was the regularity, perfection, and the kind of inhuman qualities of this ball bearing. The question that the curators at MoMA didn't ask, however, it will not surprise you to know, is who made the ball bearings, right? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I have read this amazing article, which I reprinted in the Craft Reader, if you want to have a look at it, by Sergei Alashev, who is a Russian anthropologist. And he went to the ball bearing factory on the right and interviewed people who worked there in the 1980s, so during the period of Soviet economy. And on the left, I'm showing you an older picture that I found of ball bearing makers. And it's a kind of earlier social realist painting. So it's not set at the factory on the right, but I was so amazed to find a picture of people making ball bearings that I just put it in anyway. So what does Alashev find in this plant? Something really, really surprising. First of all, and this may not surprise you, the plant is an absolute shambles. It's so loud that Alashev certainly can't conduct his interviews inside the plant. In fact, he can barely think inside the plant because the sound of grating metal is so horrific. So let's start with that. All their material is inadequate to what they're trying to do, so it constantly thwarts their efforts. And also the machines that they use are constantly breaking down. So how do they feel about this? Well, the big surprise, Alashev says, is that these people prefer being at work to being at home, and in fact, they have a stronger affective relationship to their machine tool, most of them, than they do to their spouse. This usually means their wife, because most of these people are men. And Alashev is puzzled by this. How can this be? How can this place where I can't even bear to sit for 5 minutes be the emotional center of these people's lives? Well, it turns out that they take tremendous pride in what they're doing, partly because they have to fix their machines all the time, and partly because they have to be extremely adept and cunning in compensating for their shoddy material and all the other problems that they have to contend with, which Alashev details with great humor and kind of accuracy and perceptiveness. And I think the machine part of it, since I'm thinking about tools here, is particularly interesting because he says, for example, that one worker cannot trade machine tools with another. And if somebody doesn't come in that day, nobody can use his tool because they personalize them to the extent that they cannot trade, right? So they become almost like self-portraits. And of course, these men are living under horrible economic circumstances. And so that may be one reason their home lives are so distressing. And they find a kind of solace in this reality. because it's one place where they can find a kind of control. And it's founded in the eccentricity of the machines, right? The difference of the machines one to another, just like the differences between handmade pots. Even though the ball bearings, the whole point of a ball bearing, right, is that it's absolutely round when it comes out at the end. So even though the product has none of the kind of diversity that Pi seemed to prize, it seems like there's a heck of a lot of workmanship of risk going on here, right? He also makes the extremely incisive point that it's through the breakdown of the Soviet economy that Marx's dream of an unalienated workforce seems to have occurred, rather than through the successful construction of a Soviet economy. When I told this story to Ezra Shales, he said, that sounds a little too good to be true, and maybe this guy is a Soviet apologist, which I think is a good point. But I think it still shows you something parallel in a funny way to the story I told you about Willem Delvoye and the Indonesian carvers. So when a system that's authoritarian and controlling breaks down, craft seems to be the first thing that comes into the breach that restores some sense of humanity and control. Okay, I promise you stuffed animals. Here are some. This is Mike Kelly's work, More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid. You might remember it from Thinking Through Craft because I talked about it in that book. And I've often found this to be a very useful artwork to think through these questions of craft and what I'll now call suffering, because although I realize that this is an upbeat event, I think that it's really, really important. And actually the line of mine that was quoted earlier was very much about this, that we not think about craft as a matter of self-congratulation or celebration only. We also think of it as a way of articulating things that are painful. And so I want to end the talk with a series of comments about that I hope will, rather than depress you, remind you of how very important craft is. Because if craft were only good for making happy things better, then it wouldn't be much good, right? So that brings us to Mike Kelly. More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid. The logic of the title is that each of these stuffed animals, which is attached to this Afghan, has been found by Kelly in a local thrift store like a Salvation Army and is handmade. And so Kelly sees them as these objects of tremendous pathos and condensation of a certain kind of value that went unrequited. So more love hours than can ever be repaid. How do we know that it wasn't repaid? Because the stuffed animal is in a Salvation Army, right? So it's tracking a sort of history of anonymous loss, maybe a death in the family, maybe a lack of love in the family, a breakdown in affectivity, dysfunction, the thing that I mentioned earlier that Ruskin wasn't quite able to conceptualize in his understanding of work and relations. And here we have, of course, not production within a factory, but production actually within the family itself, leading to this sort of misconnection between people, right? He's also interestingly said that this, for him, is something like a Jackson Pollock, in which each of these stuffed animals is like a brushstroke. So this is a kind of portrait in the same sense that maybe Ann Wilson's work is a portrait of Knoxville. This is a portrait of Los Angeles. Okay. Now, you can think of lots of examples, I think, of stuffed animals being used in this way to mark a site of loss. I've just brought in one. This is Michael Jackson's house just after he died. And these, of course, aren't handmade stuffed animals. They're mass-produced stuffed animals. But I think anyway that they approximate something that for us is associated with the familial. You know, the normative or kind of ideal platonic stuffed animal is one that your parent made for you, perhaps. Also, some of the tactility that we associate with craft is embedded in this object, which may seem frivolous, but it's precisely through its frivolity that it does such important work as a way of dealing with a traumatic loss. And I would not in any way want to satirize or hold myself above the people who are paying tribute to the King of Pop in this way, partly because, after all, he was the King of Pop, but also because they feel something real when they do this, right? And they need something craft-like in order to express that. So just as much as Duchamp seems not to have needed craft, these people seem to have needed it. And that seems highly instructive to me. And I think it's a great way of approaching this monument of recent art. One of the most moving things I've seen in recent years, the Heidelberg Project in Detroit. Many of you will know this. This is a project by Tyree Guyton, an artist based in Detroit. And it's called the Heidelberg Project because it's on Heidelberg Street, a row of abandoned houses, actually 2 rows of abandoned houses facing one another, like 2 zombie armies. Just a brief word on Detroit, because some of you may not have thought about it recently, although I realize it's been much in the press. But I was there recently on a visit to Cranbrook, and Detroit is an amazing place in many ways, but it's a heartbreaking place too. And I know Theaster is working there as well at the moment, and it's a good place to work because it is a landscape of pain. You have whole skyscrapers that are completely abandoned that have wind whistling through them because they have no windows, right? And this is in the shadow of those buildings almost literally. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at complete social breakdown because of the behavior of corporations chiefly, and also incompetent governance. So there are enemies to be found, but not solutions. And the question is, what is to be done? So in comes Guyton, and his preferred tools are paintbrushes and stuffed animals. So he covers these houses and also makes signs, and as you saw in the last slide, covers trees with stuffed animals, again, mass-produced for the most part, and also in a kind of strange reminder or echo of what I was saying about the handmade pots, creates with these people from the neighborhood who were working with him these very unround polka dots that he puts all over this house and also on these signs in the front. And I think this suggests perhaps the kind of power of eccentricity, what Pi called diversity, now being rammed headlong into what we perhaps are more likely to call diversity these days in our much more conscious relationships to the reality of ethnicity and how it scans across economic position and social breakdown, as I said. So what Guyton is doing is, again, perhaps not really a use of craft per se, but it's extremely hand-wrought and it's extremely eccentric, not in the sense of being a bit crazy, but in the sense of being very human and absolutely infused with a kind of affectivity. However, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I mean it, I suppose, as a recognition of the complexity of the work, the way that this installation, if we want to call it that, operates is to precisely by drawing attention to and protesting the very thing that made it possible. In other words, if these houses weren't abandoned, you can bet that this wouldn't have happened, because what suburban homeowner is going to allow this, right? And so there's a kind of feedback system here that I almost want to say reminds me of the kind of feedback system that I was talking about in tools in general, like the carving tool I talked about. Okay, last example before I close is from a show that I recently saw in Prague. Very interesting exhibition. I don't have time to tell you much about it, but it was called After Velvet, and it documented work that had been done in Czechoslovakia, I should say the Czech Republic, sorry, and other Eastern European countries since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which raises interesting issues about what I was saying about Alashev's ball bearing manufacturers. Anyway, I'll just show you 2 works from that show, which I found to be quite emblematic as a statement about post-industrialism and the sort of uncomfortable relations of production that occur in that context. The first is this, which you'll already have noticed bears a lot of resemblance to Ann Wilson's project, but is fundamentally different. What the curators decided to do was to ask the warders, the guards of this exhibition, to knit in the corner of the show and knit this kind of endless scarf that would measure the amount of time that they had been sitting there collectively, okay? And this, I think, in some ways marries what Wim Delvoye was doing with what Ann Wilson was doing, right? It seems to synthesize them because it makes real and extremely evident a kind of exploitation that's going on under your nose all the time. And who hasn't, if you have any sensitivity at all, had a twinge of anxiety or guilt about the guards who have to stand in the galleries where you're enjoying paintings on a day off. In fact, this is an art school, so many of you have been those guards, I'm sure. and you know what it is to stand there under a kind of punishing routine of sameness. And what the curators did with this gesture is simultaneously give the guard something to do, something human, something affective, again, suggesting the familial images of care that are obviously associated with knitting, exactly the same kinds of things that Kelly is finding going awry. But also giving you the kind of shuddering realization of the amount of time that they've been there. So a positive, negative image that can't be undone from itself. If you followed the scarf down the gallery, what you would find is this work. 7 paintings hung on the wall, each about, something like a 1.5 feet square. And across from them, this row of monitors. And you kind of didn't know what you were looking at until you read the wall text by the artist, Czech artist named Andrej Brody. And he talks about the visit he took to La Paz in Bolivia, in the company of some other artists. And as you can see, he says that he and his friends were thrilled by the large number of shoe blacks and the technique of these people. And so what they decided to do was give them the tools to make paintings. And of course, they had almost all the tools they needed. All they needed was a stretched canvas. So what Brody and his colleagues did was to give them these canvases, leather stretched over wood, and ask them to make the paintings. And as you can see, Brody said that while they filmed them, they covered their faces because they were ashamed of their job. And I have not been to La Paz, so I can't say with much authority what that means, but I'm going to guess that what that means is that this is a very low status occupation, of course, and also that even in an economy that must be riven with destitution and suffering, being a shoe black is considered to be a shameful thing, right? So you can only imagine the kind of psychology that Brody's dealing with here, what he's encountering. So here are the shoe blacks doing their work, applying the pigments. I realize the color looks like paint, but they're actually applying their own pigments here, using brushes to then spread the pigment around and make it an even coating, and then applying the shoe black's greatest tool, the strap, right? And I believe Brody when he says that he was amazed by the technique of these artisans, because they are craftspeople. And if you've ever seen a really highly skilled shoe black, you will not doubt that, right? It's certainly not something that's received a lot of attention from the CCA or craft museums, but it is a craft, right? And it's a craft carried out under duress. It's a craft that actually supports people's livelihoods. Then, crucially, he asked them to sign the back, according to them a degree of authorship. And then, last slide I had to show you, he ends up with these paintings. And here I've just, again, PowerPointed them into something that looks kind of like an Ellsworth Kelly, I realize. But it shows you the eccentricity, the irregularity of the results. Each of these paintings, the kind of handiwork of one shoe black. And what Brody is doing here, again, should remind you of the other examples that I've given you tonight, these issues of exploitation that flag the fact of their exploitation to you so strongly that you can't not think about it. And in fact, what could be more dramatic? I was talking to Theaster about this earlier, and this is an image he's worked with as well, for good reason. What could be more dramatic as a statement of hierarchy than having your shoes polished by someone you don't know, right? The kind of vertical geometry of that relationship, which again perhaps reminds you of walking around looking at paintings but with a seated guard in the corner, but much more extreme, much more direct, much more embarrassing, but also therefore much more affective, right? Or at least it has the potential to be so. And I think what Brody is doing in this work, whether or not it's a really great artwork, I don't in a way care about that so much, because what I care about is the situation that he's able to engage in with these people who he would otherwise be unable to approach in anything meaningful to him, right? The way that he's able to constitute at least a moment of rupture in the absolutely extreme forms of hierarchy that exists between a European artist and a Bolivian shoe black, and the way that he's trying to trade places with them, if only for an instant, and trying to kind of share some sort of experience with them. So, and this is the last thing I want to say, but in a way it's the most crucial. What craft has done here in its appropriation by all of these artists that I've been showing you to greater or lesser extents is not to solve a problem necessarily, and it's not to hold itself up as being a kind of triumphant, pure, ideal expression of humanity and virtue, but it's something much better than that, much more important than that. It is a way of grappling with, articulating real human conditions that swirl around issues of production and skill. And I think if there's a way forward for craft, that has got to be it. So thank you very much. Okay, I know it's late, especially by West Coast standards. In London, by the way, we'd be starting the lecture now. But if there are just a couple of questions, I would love to answer them for you. Or try. Yeah, there's a mic there. So if you don't mind popping back to the mic. Yeah, sorry. Partly so we can get it for the recording.
Let me try and think of the question. So I'm involved in producing objects which often have craft or use craft as a medium, I guess, not out of any sort of desperate need, but because it's usually, some of the best kind of vernacular process. And people have often spoken about work that we're doing as kind of blurring some sort of boundaries. It seems in your conclusion you're talking about, instead of the blurring of boundaries, actually using craft or using these processes to highlight where these boundaries exist. That seems an inversion of a kind of common parlance about blurring the boundaries between art and design, blurring the boundaries between craft. Are we at a moment where we could start being more political and more, hate to say ideological, but focused in our application of such thing as craft?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Just briefly, my answer to that is that while the post-disciplinary condition undoes some boundaries, it makes others more evident, and it also gives you access to means of dealing with boundaries that are intractable. So I don't care at all about art, design, craft boundaries in categorical terms. I think they're artifacts of an earlier way of thinking, really. And I think that craft performs differently in a post-disciplinary condition than art and design do, chiefly because art, at least in a sort of post-Duchampian sense, is infinite in its means, and design is founded in a principle of control and authorship, whereas craft, it seems to me, still has something of its, what I've called its supplemental character, and its tendency towards self-effacement and perhaps marginalization and subordination. So making something possible. And for that precise reason, craft seems to be the thing that seems to me most fluid and moves laterally the most within the post-disciplinary condition, actually more than art, because it can escape the art world, go into the factory and come back again, right? Or indeed any other non-art space, which art by definition can't. So craft is the kind of cunning jester, perhaps, in this post-disciplinary condition. And for that precise reason, when we do strike an intractable boundary, like the one between Andre Brody and the Bolivian shoeblack, it's craft that seems, if not necessary, then certainly extremely useful as a way of engaging that boundary. So what we don't want to do is say, great, post-disciplinarity is upon us, we can all go home happy. What we should instead do is say to ourselves, this is a moment when our means for dealing with injustice have, through the things that we study at places like CCA, have radically been expanded, and it's respect for craft skill that will play a large role in doing that. Any other questions? We're going to do, you're all going to get a turn once we go around the room. Yeah.
I have a very sort of, in this crowd, probably not too learned question, but what started your interest in craft in the first place? I mean, at what point did craft have significance for you in your life? Was it through a teddy bear, or was it through the making of something? And I'm just curious about you, because that was such a well-articulated and intelligent talk.
Thanks. I can only agree with you. That's very nice of you. Okay, so I told the story actually earlier today. So it was holding a Chinese pot in my hands. It wasn't anything I had made. And in fact, I'm embarrassingly, my entire life has been spent on one side of the theory-practice divide, and I think you probably can guess which side. I did have a quite beloved teddy bear, but I don't think it was that. I think it was this Chinese pot I was handed when I was an undergraduate, and I had taken this course sort of at random. And I think it was like a 9th century Tang Dynasty 3-color Sansai pot. And I remember, well, just partly just the sheer amazement at the age of 19 of turning over and over in my hands a 9th century object, but also the completely different questions that were being asked about it, which seemed to be entirely about the mentality of these people long ago, far away, completely anonymous, radically different from myself, and yet I was receiving this thing with kind of no translation required on some basic level, the physicality of it. And certainly there was also a kind of sensual material attraction there, which I guess you could say, and I'm still trying to live up to that moment, right? Like there's a kind of not non-intellectual, because I don't think it is non-intellectual, but something really, really personal and affective, to use Ruskin's word, that happened to me there that I don't think I can use up. Yeah, so that was the moment. But, you know, I think you probably all have similar moments. I don't think mine's particularly special. You know, I think everybody who cares about this cares about it for a reason that perhaps requires maybe over-explanation, which is maybe what I've been doing in my career. But, you know, again, the craft's relationship to discourse is not commensurate. So you cannot exchange one for the other, but hopefully they can do one another some kind of justice, and that's, I suppose, what I'm trying to do. Yeah, Esther. Yeah, exactly.
The machine, the cutting edge part was really interesting to me. That I think from some of the talking earlier today, I admitted that there's a kind of machine that's been built around the contemporary art world that upholds a certain set of values. That machine is also seen like in the value of a diamond, that there's a big machine that holds up this value that might be questionable, but the machine is there. And then the tool is the art market or the exhibition space. It's the painting, and art history has done a good job at suggesting that certain kinds of paintings have value, and that value increases and a person dies and value increases. And when you were talking about cutting edge, it felt a little bit like the machine for our tool wasn't big enough. And that part of being cutting edge would require a lot of language, a lot of tooling, a bigger machine. That whatever was intrinsic about the tool itself wasn't enough. And I'm not sure, because I've succumbed to believing in the big machine, building big machines so that the tool actually does less work in the machine. So I wish you would just talk a little bit more about the challenges of the machine in relationship to the tool.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Wow. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, and I think that's really right. My first instinct is just to say that CCA is trying to be that machine, or at least it should be, or part of that machine. I mean, you're saying a bigger machine, that might be true, but also certainly a better machine, which is what the machine lathe operator is thinking about. And so what this is not a new idea, because anybody who's involved with questions of institutional critique and art practice knows, or social practice, as Deborah talked about, it's the things around the art object as a commodity that have become the intense subject of interest for artists since certainly the rise of conceptualism, and before that in some cases. So I suppose for me, my contribution to that massive history of thinking which I don't in any way want to run down, right? Like, I think craft historians sometimes have a tendency to kind of lazily swat at art history as if it weren't an ally, but to me it absolutely is, and it's what I come from, you know. So I don't want to, you know, in any way invalidate what's been achieved there, but what I do want to say perhaps is that an even more fluid understanding, certainly of production, that puts skill at the heart of the discourse at least sometimes, and gets you out of anything that could be considered art, and then these kind of near art experiences like the souvenir truck, that is going to make our machine a lot better. Yeah. And if we still believe in something, anything like an avant-garde project, in other words, individual or collective work that transforms the rest of the world and achieves some kind of social justice in the end, then that has to be part of our repertoire, I guess. Maybe one last question if there is one. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We have two. Yeah. You're back in the dark there. That's okay. Go ahead.
I'll make mine quick.
Yeah.
I noticed that you slip or allied quite a lot between craft and skill. And I think that's kind of necessary for the sort of mobility that you want craft to have, to sort of move it out of these suggestions of being located within particular traditions and particular sets of history so that it can move into the factory more. But I'm curious if you can talk about how you see if there is a distinction between craft and skill, and how those get navigated, because that was something that I thought was quite curious in what you were suggesting.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I think looking back at my book, Thinking Through Craft, which has a chapter called Skill, that if I were going to rewrite a chapter or turn one of the chapters into a better book, then that would be it, because I think that's a hard problem. Just briefly, I'll say that you'd start to address that problem maybe by saying that skill, which after all is much more general than the kind of skill that I'm interested in, because you can be a skilled musician or skilled composer or skilled philosopher. I mean, skill's like really, really general in its application. It seems to me that craft is the arena in which the rubber hits the road for skill. So where skill is embedded into an object and can be assessed in its materialized form. So that might be one way of trying to define the relationship between the two, but it's a hard problem, partly because skill is such a floppy but necessary word. Sorry, do we have time to take the last question just really quickly? Yeah.
Just quickly.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what you just said a few moments ago about over-explaining. My interest is piqued by the kind of exponential growth of art commentary, especially over the last decade and a half. And I wonder if especially from your experience in publishing, if you think there's something to that we feel a need to puzzle out art and craft and explain it in linguistic terms like we haven't before, or if it's just, a function of the publishing industry and ease of printing books.
Yeah, okay. I suppose the most intelligent answer to that question would be for me to just sit down now. But instead, I'll just say that while there may be legitimate reasons to be cynical about the ever flourishing and indeed, as you said, exponentially increasing amount of discourse around all of this material, I think, first of all, in relative terms, one certainly wants to see craft given equal weight within that phenomenon. And second of all, I would say this, wouldn't I, because this is what I do for a living, but basically, I think that, like Foucault said, discourse is the arena in which power happens for modern and postmodern culture. And so I think that not just my contributions to this event, but indeed the event Craft Forward as a whole has to be conceived not just as a nice weekend, not just as a great chance to see people that you love, although it is undoubtedly both those things, but also as an intensely political and committed event. And so although it does involve over-explanation according to any kind of rational standard, it is still absolutely necessary. I'll leave it there. Thanks.